Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Wednesday Happs Takeover show. Today, we're going to be joined by Georgia, Christian Sass, and Gerald Carter. Just a reminder for everyone that the theme of the week for this week, for Friday's Stream of the Week show, is #HappsArt. And we will not be live tomorrow, Thursday. We will be live again on Friday at 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand the stream over to Christian, Georgia, and Gerald.
Today, we've tried already the second time to get this topic, which we'll announce shortly, to get it going. So thanks for all your patience. We are about to go. It's actually our 10th episode. So Georgia, what's up today?
Hi, Christian. Thanks for the introduction. Today we're going to be talking about vampire bats. And there's a lot of interaction, ways that like people and vampire bats kind of intersect through like myth and culture, and also like what researching them can tell us about ourselves as humans and our sociality. And also like vampire bats are pretty scary to people because they can carry rabies and stuff like that. So to help us talk about these topics, we have with us today our guest, Jerry Carter. So Dr. Jerry Carter, or Jerry, is a professor who studies vampire bats. So Jerry, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying vampire bats?
Sure, yeah. I'm an assistant professor at The Ohio State University. I've been working on vampire bats since, I think, like 2002. That's a really long time. So most of my life in science, I've been working on vampire bats. I've been obsessed with bats since I was a little kid. It's actually my earliest memory is seeing a bat. And I study cooperation and social behavior in vampire bats. They're actually incredibly social and cooperative animals.
That's pretty cool. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about I guess I'm curious what that looked for you first. Like, did you go to like grad school and you like immediately, you definitely like through undergrad were you like, I want to study bats basically?
Yeah, so as far back as I can remember, I've been obsessed with bats. So my earliest memory is a bat when I was, I think, 2 years old in the Philippines. So my mom is actually from a headhunting tribe in the Philippines, and they eat bats there. So my grandmother is has full sort of tribal tattoos. She's from a tribe called the Kalinga tribe. And my mom used to hunt vampire bats when she was a little girl. And I guess I went there to visit my mom's family the last time I was there was when I was 2. And I have this memory of seeing one of these large bats, a flying fox. And then later in elementary school, I saw bats in I think an animal encyclopedia. It's just obsessed with them since I was a kid. And I got interested in vampire bats my freshman year in college. And I've been studying vampire bats since then. The other thing I've always been interested in is cooperation. Like, why is it that some human societies are very cooperative and people work together to do things like, build homes, like you can think of the Amish. So I had a sort of political and sociological interest in cooperation. And then this idea of studying cooperation in vampire bats is just this perfect synergy of the two things I'm most interested in. And it turns out
Jerry,
Yeah, go ahead.
Jerry, this is such a great topic. I'm really excited. So, I mean, when I think of vampires, the first thing I think of is Dracula, and then, of course, the vampire bats. So, who came first, Dracula or the vampire bats from the name?
Yeah, the bat is named after the monster.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, so there was already this idea of a blood-drinking monster, and and so the bat is actually named after the myth.
I just put up like a video, one of your videos, Jerry, of vampire bats. And given what you've just told us, that they're very cooperative creatures, I'm gonna let this video play, and people can kind of guess like what do they think is happening here. Tell us in the comments. So these are two vampire bats in a cage. So yeah, we want to know, what do you think they're up to? But your background is really fascinating, Jerry, because I didn't realize that you had such a long-standing relationship with vampire bats, and I feel like it's kind of like a story or something, like the offspring of the vampire bat hunters becomes like a champion for them or something, or their protector. Oh yeah, we have a good question. Yeah, where in the world are these to be found? Do we have them in Europe too?
No, these are Central and South America and Mexico. So Central Mexico and South through the warmer regions of Latin America.
Cool. And is there just one type of vampire bat, or are there different species?
So there's 3 species of vampire bat, and that's out of, what is it now, 1,400, 1,500 species of bats. So there's many species of bats, and there's 3 that drink nothing but blood. Vampire bats also drink milk when they're young, but when they're adults, they drink nothing but blood, and so their whole lifestyle and biology is shaped around this very specialized diet, and there's just so many weird things about them, so many strange adaptations that they have that are really unique among mammals. They're the only parasitic mammal. They have special heat sensors for finding blood vessels close to the skin. They have unique abilities to run and jump off of the ground that other bats can't do. Just so many things. I mean, I could go on, but they're incredible animals.
Yeah, so we have actually some good guesses in the chat. We had someone say, well, Peter says they're clubbing, which is, I guess maybe they're partying in a sense. But yeah, David says, are they sharing blood? Absolutely, right? So why would they be sharing blood, Jerry?
Yeah, so a lot of animals share food by regurgitation. So for instance, the mother regurgitates food that she's fed to her offspring. So you can think of, like birds do this. The mother bird does this for nestlings. Also bees do this. It's where it's called trophallaxis. Bees and ants will feed each other through regurgitation. Some carnivores also do this. What's special about vampire bats is that they share food this way, not only for their offspring, but for other adults, including completely unrelated adults. And these relationships seem more analogous to a friendship kind of relationship than a family relationship. It's not something that they only do with their kin, their genetic relatives. It's something that we can watch develop among bats that start off as strangers. They get introduced to each other as adults, and they can build this food sharing relationship from scratch. And it seems to be something that's very reciprocal. So bats feed the individuals that feed them. And they also seem to build up these to this food sharing relationship by sort of grooming each other back and forth in increasing amounts. So we think they kind of build a new relationship, or sort of test the waters of a new food sharing relationship through this grooming behavior where they clean each other's fur, which is something that many primates also do. So they're very socially complex.
Yeah, Jerry, I find this interesting, especially from a scientific point of view. I read in your profile that you have actually built up a lab with bats. What does that mean? What do you do?
Yeah, we have 3 sort of main research goals. So one thing we do is we try to understand how bats form new relationships. So what we do is we capture bats from different wild colonies, and then we bring them into the laboratory and we introduce them to each other. And then we'll house them together for, it could be months or even years. And the goal is to see how these food sharing relationships start from scratch and lead into a long-term social relationship where these bats are essentially saving each other's lives when they're in need. And we're trying to describe how that happens. Another thing we're doing is we're taking relationships that are already established and exist. Oh, sorry. I don't know. Somebody's got a dog in there in the background. So, but yeah, we're also studying how relationships change over time. We're trying to see if the bats are choosing more cooperative food sharing partners and sort of staying away from bats that might be sort of free riders who might get blood but not give blood. And then the last thing we're doing is we're tracking bats in the wild using these little proximity sensors that we can glue onto their fur. And every 2 seconds, these sensors communicate to each other and tell us where all the bats are in relation to each other. And we can track their relationships, their social relationships from the lab to the field. And we can track which bats are associating in the field and even which cows they're feeding on. And we're trying to understand things like social foraging and pathogens, how a virus like rabies might spread from bats to cows. And we're trying to make very precise models of the social structure of bats in the wild.
Yeah, so Jerry, we have, well, it sounds a little bit like what you're telling me is like by studying these bats and their interactions, like we can learn kind of the basics maybe of how societies work, how friendships work, right? In this sort of simplified bat friendship society where we have like grooming and food sharing.
Yes. Yeah, just to say something, I mean, most people who are interested in cooperative relationships in humans would study humans, right? But there are also people who study cooperative relationships in non-human primates to try to understand the evolutionary origins of, for instance, friendships or the kinds of cooperation that people engage in. And one of the advantages of vampire bats over, say, primates is that because they're so small, they're sort of like a lab rat. So we can bring them into the lab, we can bring them into captivity, and their whole social life in the wild could be existing inside of a space about the size of a closet or a phone booth. Do they still have phone booths? I guess not. So I should say closet, a small closet. I mean, they could be spending all of their social time inside of a hollow tree. So that's a situation we can simulate in a laboratory, whereas it's very difficult to simulate the natural life of, say, baboons or monkeys or chimpanzees in captivity. You really have to study them in the wild if you want to understand the full extent of their social interactions. And so that's one of the advantages that we have with vampire bats, is we can have them in these controlled situations and also sort of manipulate their relationships. And we can really measure a behavior which is very costly to each individual. So this food sharing behavior is something they're really giving up their own food to give to another individual. And that's something that's actually quite rare in other animals.
Yeah, we have, Jerry, we have so many questions from the audience. Yeah. One of them, a couple of questions on like where they get their food from. So as I understand it, of the 3 vampire bat species you mentioned, kind of 2 specialize on mammals and 1 specializes on birds?
One really specializes on birds. One seems to prefer birds, will also feed on mammals. And then the other one prefers mammals. The most common one, the common vampire bat, prefers mammals, but it'll feed on birds, even almost anything. There's a camera trap photo of a common vampire bat riding on the back of a mountain lion or a puma.
Whoa.
So they will feed on penguins. They will feed on like reptiles, amphibians, porcupines, armadillos, almost anything.
Wait, are these like penguins in the wild or like in a lab setting? Well, I guess like they're like in Argentina or something.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, amazing. Wow. So yeah, so they get their blood from wild animals and they're kind of sneaky about it from what I understand, right? Like they have some special saliva that helps the blood flow and stuff. And do they have like anesthetizing stuff in their saliva too to, or like some way that the victim doesn't realize?
Well, they have extremely sharp teeth. They have razor sharp incisors. So the teeth that a rodent would use to chew are basically 2 tiny little razor blades. And so they can make a perfect sort of nick, cut in the skin that is very small but pretty deep. And then, yeah, they have an anticoagulant in their saliva. So when they lick the wound, the blood keeps flowing. And they'll take about a tablespoon of blood. And,
that's incredible. That's incredible. Yeah. I'm just going to add something. We've got so many questions from the audience, which is wonderful. So we're just going to start throwing them in.
Sure.
Here from Gentleman Ghost. Odd question. It is said that they were eaten. Are their body parts used for any other purpose?
So the bats that people eat are these very large flying foxes that live in Southeast Asia, Australia. So as far as I know, nobody's eating vampire bats. Vampire bats are very small, only about 30 to 40 grams. Whereas these flying foxes, they can have 5-foot wingspans.
Yeah, I actually have, like, for reference here, this is like a vampire bat, a preserved vampire bat. Let me turn off my light. And so you can see that it's like pretty small compared to me. And this is like with its wings spread out, right? So like its body is like extremely small. I mean, this is my hand. So yeah, there's just like not a lot to eat there on the bat.
You could easily hold one in your hand, although you wouldn't want to do that unless you had a glove on.
Yeah, their teeth are really designed for piercing. So yeah, let's look at real quick at some of the other chats, because people are just have so many good questions. Oh, Stanley asks, do vampire bats transmit diseases to their hosts? I think that we're definitely going to get to that, I think, later in the episode, but that's definitely...
Rabies is the big one, the rabies virus.
Yeah. And we'll talk some more about that. And so you talked a lot about their sociality too. I think one thing I want to highlight is like the reason this food sharing is so important is because blood is not a very nutritious food source, correct? And so they will actually starve to death pretty quickly if someone doesn't share food with them and they missed like eating for a few days or something like that. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. And they just eat one meal a day.
Oh, that's interesting. Like just like at the start of the night, they go out and they find some unsuspecting deer or...
It can often be, I mean, when we've watched them leave their roost, we've seen that they sometimes push it very late into the night. They're very scared of moonlight. They really like to be in the dark. And so actually, this is a video. I think we have a camera set up outside of a roost. The vampire bat flies out, looks at the camera. It's echolocating at the camera. It's using sonar to detect the camera. There's no light there. And then you can see it flies back in. But yeah, there it is. Vampire bats are unique at running and hopping on the ground like that. There's another bat in New Zealand that almost runs on the ground, but not quite. Vampire bats actually sort of have a running gait where they do a series of leaps in the air.
I think I had another video actually of them running, and this isn't one of your videos, but this is...
It sort of is. I was there when it was filmed.
Oh, it is?
So that's,
were you? Okay.
Yeah.
I've seen this video in your talks before. So this is slow motion of a bat running on a treadmill, correctly?
Yeah, this is Dan Riskin studied this. And yeah, he made this treadmill and put the vampire bats on it and then sped up the treadmill. And what he found is that they change gaits from a walk to a run, but it's a completely novel form of running. All the musculature is up in the front, so it's sort of a front wheel drive. The bats are kind of, it's like leaping with their thumbs. They're actually running on their thumbs, and then their hind limbs are just kind of going along for the ride. And so it's kind of the opposite of what a lot of other animals do, where it's the hind limbs are the major force-producing limbs, and vampire bats, it's the other way.
Right, yeah, so other bats, almost all the bats, like they can't run like this. So why is it that vampire bats are so like jumpy and hoppy on the ground and runny?
Yeah, they creep up on their prey or their host on the ground often. And they're just very stealthy on the ground. They'll sometimes feed on like the feet or the toes of animals. And they have to be able to escape from predators, so they can do these flight initiating jumps where they just leap several feet into the air and then take off, even when they get very bloated. So when they're drinking blood, they are like little water balloons. I mean, it's just incredible how bloated they get with blood. And then actually they have these super fast kidneys that let them urinate while they're feeding. So they're already condensing the blood and eliminating the water so they can get as much dry matter as possible in them. But yeah, they have to be able to maneuver on the ground and then also quickly get off the ground, whereas most bats don't go on the ground at all.
Jerry, there are thousands of questions here, and
Yeah, I'll try to. I mean, maybe I can
I
see
can.
some of them.
No, this is all brilliant. It's so interesting. Let's talk a bit about blood as a nutrient, because that's from Lisa here. I take they feed on blood for nutrients, and they feed off animals. Yeah, of course they do. But the question really is, why blood? I mean, could we actually, or is there any other mammal that could survive on blood, or is this so unique for vampire bats?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons that blood is difficult. I mean, it's got a large amount of iron. I think it's toxic for most, and too large of a quantity. Yeah, and the question of how vampire bats first started feeding on blood is unknown. There's a number of hypotheses, but they're all just kind of speculations about maybe they were feeding on blood feeding insects like horseflies and something like or mosquitoes or something, and then they just started feeding directly on the blood. Or maybe they were feeding on insects that were living on wounds, or maybe they were a kind of animal that takes a big chunk of tissue out of another animal, just kind of like bites a chunk of tissue, and then that turned into just feeding on blood. We don't really know. There's no like proto-vampire fossil. However, there are giant vampire fossils. So there's a number of very large not that large, but much larger than the vampire bats that are alive today. There were much larger vampire bats that went extinct.
Yeah, that relates exactly to David Howden's the next question, which is right online. How did they actually evolve? Did they come from fruit bats or eating ones? What do we know about the evolution?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we just don't have the fossil evidence. I mean, it's the fact that we have any fossil bats is just amazing, because bats are so small and their bones are very slight. But basically, vampire bats are in a family of bats called the New World leaf-nosed bats, the phylostomids. And this is just this incredible lineage of animals that evolved very quickly to feed on many different things. So there's phylostomid bats that feed on blood, the vampire bats. Then there's ones that specialize on fish. There's bats that feed on small vertebrates like frogs and lizards, even other species of bats. Then there's insect-eating bats that glean insects off of leaves, other insect-eating bats that are specialized for grabbing insects out of the air. Then you have bats that are specialized to get nectar out of flowers and have very elongated muzzles and really long tongues that are, there's a bat that has a tongue that's so long it has to store its tongue down at the bottom of its rib cage rather than in its mouth so it can get into flowers. So this family has just had this amazing radiation with all of these different specialized diets, and the vampire bats are just in there with the other bats. That they branched off fairly early from the other bats. We don't know much about how they evolved their blood feeding diet.
Yeah, and so speaking of the diversity of diets across bats, we have some questions. Gentleman Ghost asks the obvious question. Has the obvious question been asked yet? Will they bite humans? Any history of this?
Yeah, they'll bite people. I think they don't show a. They'll feed on just about anything, so they're not too picky. Usually, they don't feed on people because livestock are the things that they tend to feed on now. If you think about a herd of cattle out in the middle of a pasture, it's just there's very little that those cattle can do to defend themselves. And so the vampire bats will just go to them night after night and just, get little bits of blood from these cows. The cows can't really do very much. And so it's, it does happen, though, that a vampire bat might feed on a person if they're sleeping outside in one of these neotropical places without a mosquito net.
Yeah, I've heard of them getting people's toes and stuff. And I just added a picture real quick. This is a vampire bat. You can see it on the back of, I think this is a pig, a wild pig of some kind, perhaps. But you can see that paler little dot on its back is the vampire bat. So will they kind of get on there and they'll eat from the back or by the hoof or both?
Yeah, some of the larger livestock, they'll just land right on the back of the animal and like run around on their back. Or the other thing they'll do is land on the ground and then feed on the animal from the ground.
There was another question related to feeding. I'd have to scroll back up, sorry, to find who asked it, but they were wondering, do they hunt in groups or not?
Yeah, we have a paper coming out it's like coming out very soon. I think sometime in a week or something, showing that they have a sort of complex style of social foraging. They do not leave their roost together as a group to hunt. So they do not hunt in like a big swarm or a large group. What they do is they all leave separately, independently, and then somehow they meet up with the bats that they've been roosting with, probably via some coordination of their calls. And then they sort of have these encounters out there on the cattle pasture. And we are studying that more now. So we're trying to understand exactly how they coordinate their foraging. So they do forage socially, but it's not like in a big group. It's these kind of pairs or small groups of bats that are meeting up out where the animals are. And we've seen them fighting over a wound. So like one bat might make a wound and then another bat might come and steal that wound. But we also see them affiliating peacefully at wounds, or even, feeding from the same wound or feeding on the same animal.
That is so interesting. So yeah, I've heard that sometimes the birds can usually they don't, unless they've transmitted rabies to whatever they're eating from, usually the animal they're eating from doesn't die, unless sometimes it's a bird, I heard, correct? Because if like one goes after the other, and the birds are so small relative to like most mammals that like the bird can die.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. I guess it seems possible. It seems it's more likely that like a chicken might get infection from the wound, and that seems to be more of the danger. And so yeah, the real problem is rabies being transmitted from vampire bats to livestock. That's actually kind of a big problem for agricultural development in Latin America. And so I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but that's one reason why people are interested in vampire bats.
I think we should come back to that very soon. I do feel bad because I feel like people are getting more and more after we showed the running vampire bat. People we've lost people's empathy for the bats a little bit. They're scared. So tell us, let's talk a little bit more about these sort of really important and unique social bonds that they have. And I think we had a video of I think this is the video. Hang on.
Yeah, so this is the white-winged vampire bat. They have these little calls that they make to each other. The common vampire bat also communicates with calls like this. When you take a vampire bat and you isolate it, like this one is here, they make these calls to other bats. They're contact calls. They convey who the bat is and where it is. These ones will call for instance, if you put each bat in a little cage and you leave them in a stable configuration, or if you move them around but put them back in the same locations, each bat will call just say once to check on where everybody is. But if you constantly move them around, they call and they match each other's calls in order to find out where everybody is. This is an experiment just showing the bats recognize each other as individuals vocally, because we're playing sounds from a speaker of different bats, and the bat responds differently to different individuals. But vampire bats can use these calls to find their food sharing partners. So if a bat is stuck in one of these cages, I'm sorry I don't have the video there, but if a bat is stuck in one of these cages, it can call to its colony, and certain individuals will fly down and feed them through the cage bars. They'll put their face up against the cage bars and sort of pass the blood across the cage bars to help the bat inside. And you see this not only for family members, but also for completely unrelated bats. And so this is the main thing I've been studying, is this you could call it altruistic behavior or pro-social behavior. It's certainly cooperative behavior.
Well, this just poses so many questions. A very simple question when they are more about the group behavior. So is there such a thing as a boss in a group like that, or just isolated families? How do they interact? There's just so many questions.
Yeah, so in many primate societies, there's a lot of cooperation, but also a real steep dominance hierarchy among, say, females. There would be matrilines, and depending on who your mother is, you're socially dominant above other females in the group. And in vampire bats, we looked for that, and we didn't find a very clear dominance hierarchy. So they do have a dominance hierarchy, but it's very subtle, and overall the society seems very egalitarian. So all the females are breeding and seem to not displace each other. If you put feeders down there, everybody can sort of feed. One interesting thing is that female vampire bats are larger than males and are probably socially dominant over males. And the males do not seem to be able to control the movement or the behavior of females. And most of the social structure in vampire bats are stable relationships among females, whereas the males seem to, they don't engage in this food sharing with each other hardly at all, or with, there's a little bit of food sharing from females to males and from males to females, but most of it is among females. And that might be because female vampire bats just have really, they have stable relationships, but they also invest a lot in reproduction, and they're spending a lot more energy in raising offspring. So their gestation period is like 3 times the duration of other bats. So you can have a 6-7 month gestation period, and then they're nursing bats for their offspring for incredibly long time. A vampire bat can live to be 30 years old, and there's records of them 15, 18 years in the wild. So they're incredibly long-lived for their size, and they have these offspring relationships where a mother-daughter pair will, after the daughter grows up, it just turns into a potentially lifelong mutual support network of like a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. They're all sort of share food with each other back and forth to whoever didn't feed that night.
I'm curious, so they have these friendships. Are the friendships usually equal? Because you can observe them pretty closely in the lab. It's like, oh, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Or are there some bats that are popular, and it's like, oh, I just I'm hungry, and people are like, oh, here, let me help you because you're so cool.
Yeah, it seems to be a mix of both. So the relationships are largely symmetrical if you measure, for instance, grooming rates and food sharing rates. But there are bats that seem to be sought after as partners more than others, and there are certain bats that seem to be more popular than other bats. One hypothesis we have is that each bat is trying to manage the quantity of relationships it has with the quality of relationships it has. So you could be a bat that has a few very strong relationships, or you could be a bat that has many sort of weaker social ties. And I think that the strategy that does better depends on how stable the social environment is. So we did an experiment where we sort of lined up the bats, from the ones that are the most, that have the biggest social networks versus the ones that have the most focused networks. And we looked at how well they cope with the removal of a bat from their network. And basically the bats that have smaller, stronger networks, so a few relationships that are very strong, those bats they do better on a typical day, or at least they don't do any worse on a typical day. But when you remove a primary food donor, the other bats, the ones that have been feeding other non-kin outside their family, they're able to cope with that better because they have sort of backup relationships to their immediate family. And so it's sort of an interesting thing to think about these different kinds of social networking strategies. And it's also interesting to consider whether this is something that is important outside of vampire bats, and it might be found in other species, including humans. I think there's data that are consistent with this, that humans are also sort of doing something like this, that when we're in a very unstable social environment, we try to make more friends, even though we have a preference for having fewer, closer friends. But we just can't always have that. So we try to have as many sort of social ties as we can, depending on how stable the environment is. Like, so for instance, in college, where people are coming and going, you might be extending your time, your social time, to more people than you would ideally want to be. You'd be sort of distributing your social time out more rather than having a more focused network.
Yeah, I feel like I'm watching that happen right now, right out the window at the university. There is tons of socializing and friendship forming happening as people like come onto campus for the first time in a while. Do they change behavior? Sorry, I lost the question.
I think somebody was asking, does the sociality of vampire bats change when the social structure changes? And that's exactly the kind of thing that we're investigating. So something that we're in the middle of analyzing right now is, we know, for instance, that there's some bats that are just consistently more cooperative than other bats. So if you introduce them to a panel of strangers, they will go and groom those strangers more than another bat introduced to the same panel of strangers. So you could sort of label bats as like, this is a more cooperative bat, or this is a more social bat. And then the question is, if you take two social bats and you put them together, does that mean that the relationship is definitely going to be this like strong relationship? Or can you not predict the relationship outcome from the traits of the individuals? This is a really interesting and fundamental question that we don't know the answer to yet. Like, how predictable is a relationship outcome from the sort of personality traits of the two individuals? And it seems to be the case that a lot of it is actually just the history of that relationship, or at least it's not very predictable from the two bat identities.
Okay, if I could try to paraphrase that, because I think it's really interesting. This is probably not the most scientific way of saying it, but are you saying that like the strength of like the relationship seems to be more dependent on like what those two bats like history was, like what they've experienced together, versus like what their personalities are? Okay.
Yeah, it's like if you have a friend Jane who's really friendly, and you have a friend Jill who's really friendly, and you think, okay, well, if we put them together, they should be really friendly. But actually, you don't know what could happen. Maybe they don't get along because their personalities are just out of sync in some way that you couldn't predict. So yeah, I mean, this is essentially, I think what we're seeing is that there's a lot of complexity in the relationships. It's not just a function of the personality of the two individuals. We also see that we can't necessarily predict the relationship outcome from how the bats first interact in the first like few hours that they meet each other. So bats that seem to get along immediately when you put them together doesn't necessarily mean that a year from now those bats will be good friends or not.
That's really interesting. So what are some general like takeaways or lessons that you think that you see in vampire bats that we can bring into like our understanding of human social interactions? I mean, you've mentioned some, but are there others?
Yeah, so I think one thing I don't know if this comes directly from vampire bats, but studying vampire bats definitely makes me think about this a lot, is to think about this interplay between cooperation and conflict within a social relationship. So I think it's very useful to think about every relationship as being a sort of mix of, there's investments that you make in cooperation, but then there's also this sort of risk that you put yourself in. If you build a relationship with a particular individual and you're putting time and energy into that relationship, it's possible that things don't work out, and it would have been better if you never had invested in that relationship at all. And so I think in animal species where relationships are really important for their survival and reproduction, they are equipped with the ability to evaluate potential partners. And I think humans are just better at this than anyone. And so much of what makes humans so astounding is our ability to cooperate. And part of that is not just a kind of unconditional altruism that we have, but a sort of ability to navigate a complex social world where we are able to identify potential collaborators and potential friends, but also detect people who might not be good for us to hang out with, or people who might be trying to exploit us, or so we have this kind of optimal balance of being wary of predatory social interactions, but also very open and eager to initiate a cooperative relationship with another individual. And I think this is something that the vampire bats are also doing, and also many non-human primates have this sort of balancing that they have to do.
Like, so in vampire bats, like, because when I think of these kinds of relationships in humans, I often think of like romantic relationships are like really primary source for a lot of people. But in the vampire bats, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like these relationships between females, like you mentioned, are really important and really strong. And like, yeah, I guess like, can you talk a little bit about like the different like sex roles and relationships in vampire bats?
Yeah, so vampire bats are not monogamous, so there's no paternal care. And I think if there was paternal care, so like for instance in songbirds where both the mother and the father raise the offspring, then you would have these cooperative relationships between males and females. But in vampire bats, basically the males are just trying to gain access to females and try to copulate with different females, and then they don't provide any real care, and the sons or daughters don't necessarily know who the fathers are. And so what you have is relationships between females where they're essentially trying to minimize the risk of not feeding. And one way to think about it is that they can't necessarily store blood in their bodies. In fact, this is the interesting part of the story, is for some reason that I don't completely understand, vampire bats don't put on fat. They're not very good at storing energy in their body. And so one way to think about this is that they're storing a kind of social capital. By having these relationships with other bats that may have access to food, they can sort of have, they have a sort of backup.
Instead of fat reserves, they have social reserves.
Yeah, and I think that, if you think about human hunter-gatherer societies, very similar sort of thing going on where, we can't necessarily, if a group of people take down a very large game together, you can't necessarily eat all that food immediately, and you can't necessarily store it either if you don't have a fridge or freezer. And so one thing you could do is just sort of agree that, hey, if I get the large game, I'll share it with your family, and if you get it, you share it with my family, and that way you can have a kind of cooperative relationship. And that cooperative relationship needs to be enforced somehow. So there needs to be some sort of principles like reciprocity that prevent one individual from exploiting the other. And that's basically what we're trying to figure out with the vampire bats, is how much enforcement of their cooperation is there. It's also possible that it's not very enforced. It's also, the alternative explanation is that they're just so inherently interdependent that there's very little incentive for one bat to try to exploit another. But in so many cooperative species, we've now seen that even when we thought this was like purely altruistic, it's really not. So for instance, in bees and ants, for a long time, people thought that, like a worker bee or a worker ant doesn't produce eggs, only the queen lays the eggs, and the workers just are altruistically helping the queen. That turns out not to be the case. Workers can sometimes lay eggs, and then they get punished by other workers. There's a whole sort of policing within the hive that represses all of the cheating and free riding that occurs, right? And so it's the same thing with a human society, where if you just were watching from the outside, you might think, wow, humans are so cooperative. Like everybody's doing exactly what they're supposed to. There's very little conflict, but it's actually that we have a whole sort of system that represses that conflict. When somebody steps out of line and starts doing things they're not supposed to, there's other individuals that are actually punishing or basically stopping that from happening.
Yeah, Jerry, I'm just curious about the energy efficiency side, because you said they can't really store very much fat or energy, yet they seem to live up to 30 years. That seems almost incredible to me, because there must be a very fine balance between their agility, their resting, their food supply, the efficiency, and so on. Is this well studied?
Yeah, well, I should say that the oldest records, like the 30-year record, I mean, those are in captivity. And in the wild, we have records of them living to be 15, I think 18 years is a
Well,
record.
still a lot. That's still a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so just in general, bats are very long-lived for their size. They're outliers. If you plot mammals with body size and longevity, it's this like very nice linear relation, or it's a log linear relationship. But if you look at the bats, they're all outliers. They're like not on that line. They're all living way longer than they should be. And yeah, there's a bunch of people studying why exactly that is, why bats are so, why they live so long. But I don't have much to say about that.
I do want to kind of like, we have probably like, 15, 20 minutes here. I want to get into the other side of the vampire bat human interaction, which is, these bats can teach us a lot about our social networks and like, altruism and how can altruism exist and stuff like that. David Howden had a good comment. Sounds like game theory. Yeah. People study social interactions through like a bunch of different fields, like evolutionary biology, and is like animal behavior is one of them, but you can see it in other fields as well. But I mean, there's a whole different, in addition to what bats can teach us, there's a whole nother aspect to this human vampire bat interaction, which is that people who have to live with vampire bats, many people who have to live with vampire bats really don't like them. And so there's this whole human wildlife conflict aspect. Can you tell us a little bit what's going on there?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's obvious why, farmers and ranchers would hate vampire bats. I mean, they could lose a number of livestock to rabies spread by vampire bats. There's a kind of tragedy, which is that the way that vampire bats are currently controlled throughout Latin America is by putting a poison on them called vampiricide, or it's basically just like rat poison with petroleum jelly. But if you put it on the body of the bat, they will spread this amongst each other socially through grooming and food sharing and all of that. And then everybody who gets it on them dies because they ingest it when they groom themselves. And people have been doing this for decades as a way to reduce rabies. And recent work done by a guy named Daniel Stryker, who's now at University of Glasgow, and has started a whole lab looking at trying to control rabies in vampire bats. He was the first person to really look at the effectiveness of this measure, and basically didn't find any evidence that it was working. And actually, the tendency was for rabies transmissions to increase in places where they were killing vampire bats. And the same.
Oh, just to clarify, yeah, it works in terms of it kills a lot of bats, correct, but it doesn't actually reduce the rabies.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, I mean, now we're all very familiar with these concepts, that, with COVID-19 and everything, but basically, vampire bats can, if it's possible, a vampire bat fights off rabies, now has a titer, is basically vaccinated against rabies. And when you just kill all the vampire bats, you're killing bats that are not only, potential hosts of rabies, but you're killing vampire bats who are protected against rabies. And when you just kill everybody, essentially what ends up happening is you have more movement. So you open up all the space and you increase the movement of bats between populations. And so that seems to actually lead to more rabies cases, because you're just sort of destroying the social structure and the population structure without an understanding of which bats are actually protected against rabies or not, right? So you could have a kind of herd immunity or something at one location. Rabies is not able to invade, and then you kill all the bats, and now new bats move in, and now those bats might be carrying rabies. So this is something that was discovered fairly recently. It's also been seen with badgers and tuberculosis. The same thing happened, where they're just killing, it's called cullings. They're just culling all of these badgers to try to prevent this pathogen, but it turns out that this had the opposite effect as intended.
Sorry, go on, Georgia.
Oh no, you go ahead.
Okay, just a quick question. Just another follow-up question, actually, to my comment here from from David Howden, do closely related non-vampiric bats. So I understand there are 3 species of vampiric bats, and the rest are all non-vampiric, 1,000, whatever, 1,000 and more, right? Also have poor fat storage, or is this just true for blood drinkers? Well,
as far as I can tell, it's only the vampire bats. And one way I see this is that if you have bats in a zoo, you'll see that the fruit bats get very chubby. Like they can be really fat.
Really?
Yeah, like these fruit-eating bats. You see them in the wild. They look like sometimes they're kind of slim, and then sometimes in zoos or in captivity they look pretty chunky. And I've never seen a chunky vampire bat. They're just always very
lean.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's really just a kind of physiological thing. Even when you feed them as much blood as they could ever want, they don't seem to gain that much weight.
Interesting. Thank you.
In the long term.
Georgia, please come in.
Yeah, I was curious about, like, I want to so to sum up what you're saying, kind of like, yeah, people have a good reason for, like, they want to protect their livestock from rabies, and so they kill off the vampire bats. One way they do that is vampiricide, right? That you talked about, but there's other ways. And like I've heard of like people starting fires in caves or going into the caves where they live and killing them. And so yeah, like what other ways do they try to kill the vampire bats? And we had a question earlier from Gentleman Ghost, like, are they only roosting in caves, or do they also use trees? So if you could answer.
Yeah, they'll roost in caves or trees or in crevices, or in abandoned buildings, or the crevices underneath a bridge. So they'll roost in places that are just dark and protected. And so the whole reason why vampiricide was used and recommended is that the original method of trying to control vampire bats was just kill all of them where they live. The problem is that people are not necessarily very good at identifying bat species. So they will come across a cave that's full of potentially, thousands or hundreds of these beneficial fruit and insect-eating bats, which are very beneficial for farmers and ranchers. And then instead, they will kill all of these bats. And it's actually a bat conservation issue. And so this vampiricide was actually sort of favored because it's a way of only killing vampire bats and not just burning down caves and going in and just vandalizing bat roosts, because this was actually a big problem for other species of bats that are becoming threatened or endangered because of persecution by people, whereas vampire bats their populations are doing very well because of all of the abundant livestock, and how when you go and you cut down the forest and you replace it with cattle pasture, you're basically creating habitat that's great for vampire bats and bad for these other bats. And so, I actually think there's another issue here, which is that vampire bats can often displace like fruit bats and other bat species from the best places in caves. And so they might even sort of outcompete other bat species within roosts, and that hasn't been demonstrated yet, but in captive studies, they will sometimes just like bite or chase away other bats to take over a preferred roost. And so that could also be happening in the wild.
Oh, wow. And so like when they apply this vampiricide, you said that they get it on the bat, right? Do they put it on like their cow or whatever, and then the vampire bat gets it on them when they land on the cow, or?
Well, the most effective way is to put it on the bats first. You catch the bat, and then you put
just
this
like go into
vampiricide
the caves and or the tree.
No, they'll put the nets around the cows. So they surround the nets with cows. The bats come in to feed on the cows. They catch the vampire bats. One of the problems, though, is that when I've worked with some of these rabies teams, so often there'll be a government team that's in charge of eliminating the vampire bats. But sometimes they don't necessarily know the benefits of these other bats. And sometimes they don't know what bat is a vampire bat. So every bat that flies into this net, sometimes they'll kill every bat. So you get these fruit bats that fly in. They think it's a vampire bat, so they kill it, or they put vampiricide on the wrong bat. And also sometimes they just are extremely rough with these bats. So if you're, you know, so you're a bat biologist, I'm a bat biologist, and we just have this, you know, when we take bats out of nets, we're very careful and we hold them very gently. And I think sometimes it's just a kind of, they're essentially, you have people who are basically acting as exterminators. And so anything that's going in this net is getting hurt in some way.
Yeah, they're little. It's easier to like squeeze it too tight and just accidentally kill it. It's a tiny little body.
Yeah.
We had a good, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, we had a good question from Stanley that was asking about like helping to spread immunity. I think it was getting at like vaccinating the bats potentially against, or maybe livestock, but yeah, do people try like vaccination efforts to reduce this like conflict?
So people, I mean, vaccinating your livestock is the best thing to do. I mean, so that's really the best solution to the problem, because you can't just, nobody's been able to eradicate the vampire bats. That's never worked anywhere. Even in Trinidad, the island of Trinidad, they've been trying to like get rid of vampire bats there, and so they're flying in from Venezuela. So you vaccinating the cattle is the way to go, but also people are experimenting with trying to vaccinate the bats. So instead of putting a poison on them, you put an edible vaccine, and then the bats spread the vaccine amongst each other. And then Daniel Stryker, who's I mentioned before, who's the person who's sort of like leading a lot of this research on strategies for reducing rabies transmissions from vampire bats, is interested in actually connecting a rabies vaccine to a herpes virus. So this herpes virus that's spreading through bats could be vaccinating the bats against rabies as it transmits. But I shouldn't say much more about that. I don't even know if that's like a
maybe more of like someone's trying it, but people try lots of things.
Yeah, I think they'll do it. I think it's doable, and I don't know. I think they have to think about you know, there's probably all kinds of complexities with that, but it's something that they're working on. But there's this edible vaccine. Actually, one of our collaborators was just testing it in captivity, and people have also sort of tested it using a kind of fake, it's like a dye, and they see if, like, if this was the vaccine, would it spread to the whole colony? And then they look and see that it did in fact spread everywhere.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And this is the edible vaccine, because they would like put it on the bat's fur, and then they would groom each other and get the vaccine, like the good version of vampiricide.
Yeah. I'm laughing at some of the comments I've seen about how Daniel Stryker is a great name for a vampire hunter.
But is vampiricide actually readily available? That was one of the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I went in like a farm store and bought it. I think I bought it just so I could like take that picture.
Yeah, I'm gonna say you bought it. What did you buy it for?
I mean, I just was, yeah. I mean, maybe I didn't buy it. Maybe I even maybe someone else bought it, but yeah, you can find it. Just
yeah, and I mean the question, I think question was specifically kind of like, if it's so bad, why can you buy it? I mean, there's lots of bad pesticides and toxins we can buy here in the United States that, you know, people really don't like pests, whether they're insects or vampire bats. And so, you know, there's pressure to make these things available to people, even if it's not necessarily very good for the environment or for wildlife. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything to add. Yeah.
Well, I think there's just a lot of things that people don't realize that they might not work that well. I mean, I've heard, so I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that these like bug zappers, you know, people have these bug zappers, the electric light and the bug comes in. I've heard that like those don't actually attract mosquitoes, and those are all like these beneficial insects that you're just zapping all night.
Oh, no.
And the mosquitoes just ignore it and go and feed on you, and you're zapping these poor little, like, you know, pollinators.
Oh, the mosquitoes are
That's
like,
just
great.
what I've heard. I don't know.
You've cleared out the airways. Your story of like killing the bats on, was it Trinidad or whatever? I forget where you said, but where they just kept coming back from the mainland. I was like, the bats are like, oh, you're clearing up island real estate.
Yeah. It's a difficult, you know, human wildlife conflict situation.
Are things like, I don't like to use the word education necessarily, because it makes it sound like people don't like already know what's going on around them. But like, are there efforts to kind of like work with like the people that are experiencing these problems a little bit more to like try to find solutions?
Yeah, I think we're putting that in this grant that we're writing right now. I teamed up with a couple of disease ecologists to use our social tracking technology and apply it to studying transmission of pathogens between bats and cows, and try to make a model of how the pathogen might transmit through this like bat cow network, vampire bat other bat network, and the vampire bat social network. Like what does all of this look like when you map it all out? And I think an important part of that is going to be, we have to have very good relationships with the local landowners, but also sort of trying to come up with practical solutions for what they can do. Like, so for instance, can they protect part of their herd by using something like lights? Like if you want to have a certain group of your herds that hasn't been vaccinated yet, and you want to put them somewhere where they're protected from vampire bats, how can you do that? Another thing that I can imagine could be important is, if you are sleeping, if you have houses that are near these cattle pastures and the bats are feeding on the cattle, and then you move all the cattle away, does that mean that the vampire bats are likely to now try to feed on the people there? Or will they ignore the people and try to fly further to find the cattle? These are some really important questions that have, obviously important implications for human health.
Yeah, I think that's really great. So thank you so much, Jerry. I think that we've all learned so much. We have, and thank you everyone for joining in the comments and stuff too. It's been really informative, and I think that I've definitely, learned a lot about like these bats and their social interactions that they have. It was great hearing from you. Christian, any final comments? Oh, you're muted.
He's muted.
I unmuted you.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I have a lot of background noise. That's because of all the all the delays we've had. So I apologize. I just wanted to say I really enjoyed this very much, Jerry, because I've been listening to your to your talks all morning to learn as much as I can, and I thought I knew a fair amount, but now you've brought in so many extra comments, especially about their group and social behavior, which I found absolutely intriguing. I can so understand why you're fascinated with this topic ever since you were a child, and you probably grow old with this, right? Or is there another topic that would ever capture you as much as vampire bats?
I've been meaning to switch away from vampire bats for such a long time, but I just keep getting pulled back because there's just always more to do, and I feel
more
that
to do.
I don't know if anyone else is going to do it, and so I feel a deep desire to just keep probing further into the work we've been doing.
Yeah, thanks. You are really an excellent speaker. It's been so enjoyable. We've had so many questions. And thanks also to everybody else for just being patient. We had some technical problems. I'm sorry about that, but we've sorted them out now.
Yeah, and if anybody is, curious, you can find more of Jerry's work at his website, socialbat.org. I put the link in the chat. A lot of the videos that we showed today, he has on his website there, and you can see just like really cool. There's also videos of other talks he's done, and there's like, it's so interesting to go there and just like wander around and see the names of his papers and stuff. And you recently won, I should have said this at the beginning, but you recently won like an award for an outstanding new investigator by the Animal Behavior Society. So he's doing a lot of cool research and sharing a lot of just like interesting information with everybody, and I hope you all take advantage of it.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter too. I forget it's like Jerry G. Carter or something like that. And I pretty much just tweet about vampire bats.
Very good.
Yeah, follow him on Twitter. So with that, so thank you everybody for joining. This was the 10th episode of the Humans and Wildlife Show. Follow me and Christian here on Happs or wherever you're viewing from for more content. Next week for episode 11, we are going to be interviewing the Bug Chicks, who are two women who use, they basically use they have classroom education stuff that they do with insects to help people learn about insects, but also learn about empathizing with those who are different from them. The bug chicks recently won an award from the American Entomological Society, which is the group of scientists who study insects. They got an award for this for kind of the best insect social outreach thing. So we're going to be talking with them next week. And we hope that you can join us for that. Christian, final comments.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. So next week we're going to the very small dimensions again, and then we'll see what comes after the week. Maybe we'll go to the larger dimensions again, large wingspans. We'll see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.